Episode 238, RLP with DNA 1, Take a DNA Test. Today's episode is sponsored by newspapers.com. Break down genealogy brick walls with a subscription to the largest online newspaper archive. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogist professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the authors of Research Like a Pro, a genealogist guide. With Robin Worthland, they also co-authored the companion volume, Research Like a Pro with DNA. Join Diana and Nicole as they discuss how to stay organized, make progress in their research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go! Hello, and good morning, and welcome to Research Like a Pro.
Hi, Nicole. How are you today?
I'm doing great. What have you been working on or doing?
Well, I discovered on my shelf, doing some cleaning, the second book of Brooks Blevins' series of the history of the Ozarks. Do you remember all last year I was reading Volume 1, and we talked about several things on the podcast about that, and I had ordered Volume 2, but kind of forgot about it. So I found it and just started reading that this week, and I'm already loving it. It's titled The History of the Ozarks, The Conflicted Ozarks. And the last volume left off kind of mid-1850s. So this is going to cover the Civil War era. And the very, very first chapter starts talking about the attitudes of the people towards slavery. And I am so interested in this because as I looked at the map of what's considered the Ozarks, kind of the southern part of Missouri, northern part of Arkansas, I realized that so many of our families came from that exact area. And so I am always interested in learning more about the history of where our people lived. Let me just read a little bit of the Amazon description. The Ozarks of the mid-1800s was a land of divisions. The uplands and its people inhabited a geographic and cultural borderland straddling Midwest and West, North and South, frontier and civilization, and secessionist and unionist. As civil war raged across the region, neighbor turned against neighbor, unleashing a generation of animus and violence that lasted long after 1865. The second volume of Brooks Blevins' history begins with the region's distinctive relationship to slavery. Largely unsuitable for plantation farming, the Ozarks used enslaved persons on a smaller scale or in some places not at all. So that just gives a little bite of what's going to be talked about in this book.
Well, that's neat that it calls out the fact that it was unsuitable for plantation farming, and I hadn't really thought too much about the different geographic features causing plantations to be unsuitable. But that makes sense that in the Ozarks it wasn't the norm.
Exactly. Rocky, very forested. And I remember when we had our class on Missouri, we talked all about the regions, the geographic regions in Missouri, and along the rivers, the Missouri and the Mississippi, where you had the floodplains, and it was typically more agricultural. That is where the plantation farmers from the South would come and claim all that land. So I just read this morning that by the 1850s, all of that good plantation land was taken. And so what was left was more of this land that was just difficult to actually farm, which makes me wonder if that's why our ancestors did not stay, because they all eventually migrated to Texas.
Right.
So maybe they thought, okay, this is great. I'm getting this land patent of, so many acres. But then when they actually try to make a living on it, they realize, this isn't where I want to be. Let's try somewhere else. Just a thought.
Well, great. I'm glad you're going to be reading that. Are you just going to read a little bit every week?
Yeah, it's pretty in depth. And so I just read a couple pages. And, it's a beautiful hardbound book, but I have my red pencil out and I'm highlighting the important concepts because I go back through these books, and when I'm writing reports or writing about the ancestors, I want to find those little tidbits that I can use that talk about some of the attitudes. And I love that he includes journals and histories. He's really made a really nice compendium of a lot of written work that's out there, including primary sources, people's stories about it.
Great. Well, for announcements, our Research Like a Pro webinar series for 2023 is still accepting registrants and will all year. If you register, you have access to all 12 of the webinars for the year. They are going to be monthly case studies featuring the Research Like a Pro and Research Like a Pro with DNA process. We already had January's webinar where Diana talked about her Benjamin Cox case. And the handout for each of these webinars is a research report that the presenter wrote when they were working on their project. Next month, I'll be talking about my Daniel Arnold report, which utilizes autosomal DNA and Y-DNA. Then that will be followed by Alice Childs in March, who's an accredited genealogist who I worked with on the second phase of the Daniel Arnold project. So she'll be sharing how she continued the research on that case and conclusions that were made. So that'll be fun. And we have several other people lined up for 2023. And if you would like to present one of your research projects, we invite you to submit your application on our website. Also, we've been looking at the dates for this fall for the next Research Like a Pro study group, and that will begin in August and end in November. So we'll be looking for peer group leaders as usual who would like to be part of the study group and would receive complimentary registration. So apply on our website. And if you're not a member of our newsletter yet, you should definitely become one so that you can hear all of our news, see new blog posts and podcast episodes, and any coupons that we have.
Right. So we have all sorts of exciting things going on, and Roots Tech is just right around the corner. So we encourage you to register for Roots Tech. And if you can't come in person, be sure to take advantage of the free online version. And NGS, the National Genealogy Society Conference in Richmond, Virginia, is open for registration as well. And that will be in person, and then they will also have an online version. So I think that's one of the great things that has come out of COVID is having so many online options to do institutes and conferences. And I'm not seeing that go away. Everybody really loves that version. But I, for one, am excited to be in person again. It's always fun.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we are starting a fun podcast series where we're going to be talking about the Research Like a Pro DNA process. And so we're going to go through each chapter and record one episode per chapter. So we'll have 12 episodes. And, I'll just give you a little preview of those straight from the table of contents. So we will have Take a DNA Test as Chapter 1. Chapter 2, Assess your DNA matches and analyze your pedigree. Chapter 3, Organize your DNA matches visually with diagrams and family trees. Chapter 4, Create a research objective. Chapter 5, Write source citations for DNA and documentary sources. Chapter 6, Analyze your sources and evaluate your DNA matches. Chapter 7, Locality, Research, and Ethnicity. Chapter 8, DNA Tools and Methodology. Chapter 9, Research Planning with DNA. Chapter 10, Research Logs and Writing as you go. Chapter 11, Correlating Findings and Finishing the Research Report. And finally, Chapter 12, What's Next? Publishing, Productivity, and Further Education. So as you see, we take you through an entire DNA project. At the beginning, we help you learn what to do with your DNA and get organized with your matches, and then how to choose a project and go all the way through doing something. So we invite you to follow along with us, try a project on your own, and see what you can discover in your DNA.
All right, well, let's get started with Chapter 1, Take a DNA Test. And this chapter was written by Robin Worthlin, our colleague. And we start off talking about how DNA was one of the great discoveries of the 19th and 20th centuries. And DNA includes 4 bases called adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. And these are usually abbreviated with the letters A, T, G, and C. And it's been amazing that in the last 150 years, human DNA has been described, isolated, and studied. And a lot of advances in technology and scientific breakthroughs now enable us to use DNA as a genealogical research and discovery tool, which is just so exciting. So DNA is a biological connection to our ancestors. We inherited it from them. So using DNA can help us extend our family lines and learn more about our ancestors. We glimpse into the past as we examine our DNA results compared to the DNA results of others who have been tested. Human DNA comes in 2 types, nuclear and mitochondrial. Nuclear DNA is inside the nucleus of the cell, and within the nucleus, you'll find 23 chromosome pairs. The first 22 are autosomes, and then chromosomes 23 are the sex chromosomes, the X and the Y for males, and 2 X's for females. So that is all the nuclear DNA. And then the other type of DNA is mitochondrial. And all people have mitochondrial DNA, and it's found within the mitochondria in each human cell.
Great. Thanks for that review of exactly where our DNA comes from. You know, we probably all studied this in our high school biology or college biology, and isn't it funny that now we're doing family history and we're returning to that? So let's talk a little bit about DNA tests. And as you said, Nicole, there are the 22 autosomes, and so that's where we get the term autosomal DNA. And we often abbreviate that as the lowercase at and then uppercase DNA. So when you see that in people's writing or discussing things, just know that's autosomal DNA. And that looks at the chromosome pairs 1 through 22, the autosomes. And some testing companies also look at the X chromosome for their autosomal tests. So not all companies report that, but some do. Now, most human DNA is the same, and tests look at 700,000 locations in the autosomal DNA. And the SNPs, we call them SNPs, but that stands for single nucleotide polymorphisms. So you can see why we just call it SNPs, and you'll see that written as capital SNP. And this is where the DNA code is more likely to vary. So where yours is going to be different from your neighbor's. And so the results, when they come in after you take your DNA test, compares your DNA with the results of others in the database. And so your raw DNA, if you were to look at it, it's just a list of nucleotides, those A, G, C, and T's in all different forms. So those can be mixed up, and that's what our DNA looks like when it's raw. But we wouldn't know what to do with that. So the companies do their magic, and they produce a match list of people who show the amount of DNA shared in centimorgans. So let's talk about what a centimorgan is. Centimorgan is a unit of measurement of the likelihood that DNA will recombine. So it's random recombination, and we have to know this, that even though we will inherit autosomal DNA from all of our ancestors on all of our lines at the earliest levels, such as parent, grandparent, great-grandparent, as we move further back on the tree, we are not going to get DNA from all of our further back generations. That doesn't mean they're not your ancestors. It just means that you may not have gotten a little piece of DNA from them. So there is a limit of how far back we can go with autosomal DNA. And with today's technology, that's about 6 to 8 generations. So if you're interested in learning more about family members, take your autosomal DNA test and then consider having other people. And we talk a lot about having the further generation up the tree take a test. So if you've got a grandparent or a great aunt, their DNA will be better than yours because they are closer generationally to those people further on your tree. So the amounts of shared centimorgan can be compared with expected amounts of shared DNA for relationships. If you share a lot more DNA with someone, that usually means a closer relationship. And so if you see your sister, your brother, your children, your parent, your first cousin, you're going to have significant numbers of DNA, whereas a third, fourth cousin is going to be much smaller. And we use that to help us figure out who these DNA matches are. So DNA information is meaningful in family history research only when compared with other DNA test takers. And we have to compare family relationships, and we have to do genealogy. Use our documentary research to put all of this together.
Absolutely. People who are unfamiliar with DNA testing for genealogy sometimes wonder, how do you figure out anything about your ancestors if you're not testing the DNA of your ancestors? And the key thing to understand there is that your shared DNA with another person traces back to a connection to a common ancestor. And so comparing the tree of yourself with that match can help you see which ancestor you probably got that DNA from, that shared DNA. So as long as you understand that, then you'll understand how we use it for genealogy research.
Right. I know when I first approached my dad about it, he thought we were going to dig up an ancestor. He's like, how are you going to do that? So it's a valid question. How do we use our DNA to figure out our ancestors? It's really remarkable. where we've come with this whole thing.
Right. So autosomal DNA tests are offered by several companies, and the ones that are most reputable and most often used for genealogical research include 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage DNA, and Living DNA. So I'm going to talk briefly about each of those. So 23andMe has a reputation for having the best ethnicity estimates. So if you're really wanting to see more about which segments of DNA came from which populations of the world, then that would be a great one to test with. They actually have a unique ethnicity chromosome browser that shows which sections of your DNA came from which ethnic backgrounds. They also have a lot of tools to help you see which segments of DNA you share with your relatives. So that's wonderful. And they have a pretty large database too. Ancestry DNA has the most family trees associated with the people who've taken DNA tests, which makes it easier to find your common ancestor with them. And they also have a huge database, over 20 million people. So we really recommend starting with Ancestry DNA or 23andMe or both. Family tree DNA is known for having useful analysis tools to compare and understand DNA data. They also store DNA samples for up to 25 years, which can be helpful if you don't have access to test that person again and you want to have another kind or part of their DNA tested. They also offer mitochondrial and Y-DNA tests. MyHeritage DNA has a significant European customer base, so that can be really useful if you're looking for matches in Europe. They have a neat analysis tool called the in-house auto cluster feature so that you can see your DNA matches put into groups or clusters. And Living DNA is based out of Great Britain, so they have very specific ethnicity estimates broken down to the regional level of the British Isles. And so this can be really helpful if you have ancestry from that area.
Right. Thanks for taking us through each of those companies. I know I taught a week-long course at the Brigham Young University Education Week last August, and it was all about beginning with DNA. And every single class, I would talk about the different companies, and not so much the companies, but the types of DNA. And by the end of the week, the top question was still, what kind of test should I take? And so it really made me realize that a lot of people are confused. You see all these ads and you just wonder, which one should I test with? What is the value? And so it's just good to know. And personally, I have tested on 23andMe, and I had my mother test on 23andMe. And then I had my mother do Ancestry DNA, and I've done Ancestry DNA. And then I've uploaded those also to Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage, and Living DNA. So the reason I did that is because my father had passed away before we could do autosomal DNA test for him. So having my mother there, who has since passed away, now I can, see all the matches that don't belong to her and know they're my paternal matches. So it's been really helpful to have that. So, just consider how you can get the best DNA for covering your ancestors among your living family members, and take the plunge and have them test, you test. You want to get your DNA into the databases if you're going to use it for genealogy.
Right. I remember when we started getting people tested in our family and we didn't really know what to do with the results, but we just knew we needed to get them all tested.
And so glad we did, right?
Yeah, it's been great to have all my grandparents except one test.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the Y chromosomal DNA and mitochondrial DNA. And then at the end of this episode, we'll go into a testing strategy so that if you do have that question of who to test, we'll give you step by step. So, Y chromosomal DNA is inherited by men from their fathers. And so you'll often hear the term patrilineal, meaning that it's passed down from father to son in a line. Whereas autosomal DNA that we talked about earlier is inherited from all of your ancestors, from your parents, your 4 grandparents, your 8 great grandparents. And then, of course, like we said, when you go back too far, some of those ancestors didn't contribute DNA to you, but they could have. So back to Y DNA, this is inherited only by males. So men can take the Y DNA test. And it's really useful for working on your surname line if you're in a culture that has surnames passed from fathers to children. Sometimes, though, you may discover that somewhere in your surname line there was a misattributed parentage event. And so If a male takes a Y-DNA test and his results come back, and instead of matching all Smiths like he thought he would, he matches all Johnsons, that indicates that there may have been a misattributed parentage event somewhere in his patrilineal line, just meaning that somebody who thought their father was a Smith didn't know that like their father was someone else. There's a lot of reasons that kind of thing happened, and it actually happened probably more frequently than most people realize. So in the Y-DNA test, there's two kinds of tests. There's the STR test and the SNP test. So we've already kind of talked about single nucleotide polymorphisms, the SNPs. So first, let's talk about the Y-DNA STR tests and how that is different. So short tandem repeats, or STRs, are short regions of DNA where a small motif is repeated several times in a consecutive sequence. Then those motifs are compared with other people, and however many motifs you have versus somebody else, then you can kind of see a difference between you and that person. So if I have 11 repeats on one area and another person has 13, then they have a genetic distance of 2. So these differences are called mutations. And mutations occur when DNA is replicated before being passed on to the next generation. And mutations don't always happen. Usually a father and a son will have the exact same Y-DNA STRs. But sometimes, between the father and the son, there will be a mutation. So that's kind of how genetic distance is estimated in a match list of Y-DNA STR tests. The genetic distance just reports how many mutations differentiate the two haplotypes. And sometimes there will be sections of DNA that are fast mutating. And so there may be, 2 or 3 differences between you and a great grandfather if you have like a second cousin who's tested and you're looking at the differences. And that could be that they are on fast mutating markers. So that's something to be aware of in your Y-DNA analysis. So Family Tree DNA offers Y-DNA tests. They have the Y12, Y25, Y37, Y67, and Y111 levels. And those were all names of tests that were offered at different times by Family Tree DNA. Now you can start off with either a Y37 test or a Y111 test. And those are the ones being offered. And then if you want to do a SNP test with your Y-DNA, then you can take the big Y700, which is a much more advanced test. And it looks not just at, 37 or 111 markers, but it tests the entire chromosome and all the SNPs. Well, it tests 700 SNPs. And it also tests many of the STRs, even more than 111. So that's the biggest Y chromosome test. And I actually recommend that one just because it gives you your specific place on the Y-DNA haplotree and can be really useful. The science is really advancing in the big Y700 test. And it is more expensive, but there's the potential to learn a lot more by taking that test, especially as the database grows. And at first, when I had my father-in-law test on the big Y700, he didn't really have any matches there, but there's been some new matches there that have come in. So it's starting to be really helpful. There are other companies that look at the Y chromosome, like 23andMe and Living DNA. They look at some of the SNPs on the Y chromosome, but they don't test 700 SNPs like Big Y. They don't tell you how many SNPs they're testing, but they do test enough to give you an estimate of what your Y-DNA haplogroup would be. So Living DNA and 23andMe can give you that estimate when you do their DNA test.
And Y-DNA is a test that you can go further back, much further back than those 6 to 8 generations that autosomal can only do, because that Y chromosome just keeps getting passed down through that direct line. And so we see a lot of people using that to try to connect their Smith that immigrated from England to Smiths in England. That's some of these surnames. It can be really helpful to have a lot of different people test and compare, and especially if you upgrade to the big Y700, find your unique place on that haplotree with your group. So I think we're just really starting to break open the possibilities of using Y-DNA. And one of my goals is to find a Y-DNA test taker for each one of my lines. I have a lot long way to go. I only so far have my Schultz line, which was taken from the old Y DNA. So I have a new one coming, but that would be a wonderful goal, wouldn't it, to have a Y DNA test taker for all your lines?
Yeah.
Certainly would take some time and some money. Well, let's talk about mitochondrial DNA, because men are not the only ones that have the special DNA, because women, actually all people have mitochondrial DNA, but only women pass it on. And so this is one that you can use for your female line. Same as Y-DNA, 23andMe and living DNA will give you a mitochondrial DNA haplogroup estimate. But if you test at Family Tree DNA for the full mitochondrial DNA test, then you get a match list. And so that's where you want to do your testing. There are not as many people in this database, and so you'll get matches, but the most useful way to use mitochondrial is with targeted testing and to get a hypothesis of who you think your female ancestor might be, and then target test some people that you have a track record, actually a proven line coming down the mitochondrial line that you could see if your ancestor or you match. So something to remember about mitochondrial DNA is that it mutates very, very slowly, much slower than Y-DNA. And so your common ancestor could have lived hundreds or thousands of years ago. I know I've had some mitochondrial DNA done on my lines from one of my cousins, and when I look at the match list, none of the surnames are the same, which is to be expected because females change their surnames. You don't see that same surname pattern as with the Y line that we have with the Western culture. But you have to realize that some of your matches, your common ancestor could be so far back that you would never be able to find her. So that's why we say it's best for testing hypotheses. So if you do have an exact match at the full sequence, you could be related within a genealogical time frame. It's just more research in the documents, trying to figure out where the connection could be. So mitochondrial DNA, very useful, very unique.
Yeah, I like what you said about using it to test a hypothesis. It seems like you can get really conclusive results if you have two possible mothers for a woman. Like, say, a man had two wives and you don't know which one the daughter is descended from. Well, testing a descendant from each of those women can help you rule one of them out.
Right.
And ruling somebody out is a very conclusive way of eliminating a conflicting hypothesis and helping you establish proof of the other person.
Right. That's such a common problem when you know that there was a second wife and you don't have the exact date of birth for your ancestor because, sometimes it's just an estimate. And so that's a great way to use mitochondrial DNA.
Right. But we can't always rule somebody in or conclusively prove them because their mitochondrial DNA matches, because there could be other reasons for that. They could maybe be like other relationship with a common ancestor further back in time. So it's tricky to know exactly what you can learn from it, but you can definitely get a lot of clues. You can rule things out very conclusively, and you can test those hypotheses.
Right. I think with DNA, we have to remember we're often trying to disprove something as much as prove it. It is science, and that is the scientific method to disprove every hypothesis until you have only one standing that it could be.
Right. It's time for a word from our sponsor. Did your ancestor disappear from vital records? Maybe they moved or got married. Newspapers.com can help you find them and tell their stories. Or have you ever had trouble figuring out how people tie into your family tree? Newspapers are filled with birth notices, marriage announcements, and obituaries. Items like these are a great resource for determining family relationships. On newspapers.com, you can explore more than 800 million newspaper pages from across the US, UK, Canada, and beyond in just seconds. Their easy-to-use search feature lets you filter your results by date, location, a specific paper, and more. When you find something interesting, the newspapers.com clipping tool makes it a snap to share it with family and friends. You can even save it directly to your ancestry tree. For listeners of this podcast, newspapers.com is offering new subscribers 20% off a Publisher Extra subscription, so you can start exploring today. Just use the code FAMILYLOCKIT at checkout. Okay, well, let's talk about X chromosomal DNA. Remember that the X chromosome is one of the sex chromosomes. And both men and women have an X chromosome. Women have two X's, men have one because they also have the Y. And the X chromosome has a unique inheritance pattern. So it's really useful because you can figure out exactly which ancestors could have contributed your X DNA to you. So then you have a list of possible ancestors that you could have inherited that DNA from to help you find the common ancestor with an X DNA match. What's recommended is that you use X DNA along with autosomal DNA to help you figure out common ancestors with your matches, who you share X DNA with. If you're a male, then your X matches can help you learn if your match is maternal or not, because you're not going to get an X match with somebody from your father's side, only from your mother's side. Another thing to be aware of with xDNA is that it has a high probability of false matches for small segments, which are generally under 10 to 15 centimorgans. So if you only share 8 centimorgans with somebody on the X chromosome, it might be a false match. So if you're sharing a significant portion of xDNA, at least 10 to 20 centimorgans, then you can look at your list of possible xDNA ancestors and see if you can find common ancestors with them.
Yeah, the xDNA is really fun to explore, and a really good thing to do is to look at a chart of the xDNA inheritance for the male and for the female. And Blaine Bettinger has got these charts on his blog post titled Unlocking the Genealogical Secrets of the X Chromosome. 2008 is when he published that. And we also have the charts in our book with his permission. Because it's just a little tricky, it's really important to know which ancestors you could have inherited the X chromosome from. So on my pedigree chart on my wall, I actually went through and put an X on everybody that I could get an X from. It's really neat when you can use it, but it is a little tricky.
Right, and not every company tells about X matches either, so that makes it harder to use too.
Right. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about informed consent. So we all have heard the stories about someone finding out their father's not their father, or their grandfather's not their grandfather, or, these stories are going to happen to everybody because eventually back on the family tree you're going to find a surprise. So it's really important that when we ask someone to take a DNA test for us, that we have them know what they're getting into. And a good way to do that is to really discuss with them the long-term implications of taking a DNA test, that there could be an unknown relative discovered or some family connections are not biological. And so you can write up a simple informed consent and give that to them, talk with them about it, have them sign it, just so that they know, because the last thing you want to do is have someone take a DNA test for you and then you have to break the news to them of something pretty close that is unexpected. And so you can do that through email, you can give it to them in person, but it's just a good practice whenever you are doing DNA testing. And it's also really important to look at the DNA testing company's privacy policies and just make sure you understand how your genetic data could be used, and only use the companies where you feel comfortable with that. If you are worried about your data, then read carefully the privacy policies.
Right, and often those privacy policies are contained in their terms of service. So read those carefully so that you know what they will do. And some companies are going to be sharing with law enforcement and other companies won't. So if that's something that you want to watch out for, then do some research. All right, so lastly, today we'll talk about a testing strategy. So like we mentioned, the two autosomal DNA tests that are most popular, that have the most people in their database, are Ancestry and 23andMe. So we recommend that the first autosomal DNA test that you take is the Ancestry test, and then take the 23andMe test after that. And after you've got those done and you've got your results back, you can download your raw DNA data from either Ancestry or 23andMe, and then you can go ahead and upload it to Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage, and GEDmatch. GEDmatch is a third-party website that allows you to find matches across different companies, and they have a lot of different tools, including xDNA. But make sure that you're comfortable with their terms of service before you upload there. So after you've uploaded to those companies, then you can think about if you want to take the living DNA test, or you can also upload your raw DNA there. Then take a Y-DNA test, or ask a male in your family to do that. Then take a mitochondrial DNA test. So there's the strategy that we recommend. And then some tips are to test those who are generationally closer to the ancestors, and that's typically the oldest generation in your family. And if you don't have both of your parents to test, then you can test siblings. Your siblings will have some unique segments that you didn't get from that parent who didn't test. That's because each parent randomly gives half of their DNA to each child, and they might have gotten a different half. You only need to test your siblings and yourself if both of your parents didn't test. If both of your parents tested, then you and your siblings' DNA is just redundant from your parents. Also, a tip that we mentioned earlier is to test your first cousins, your second cousins, your third cousins. And doing this allows you to isolate certain family lines, your first great-grandparents, second great-grandparents, and figure out matches that are on that line.
Right, that's a great strategy. And now that we have so many people who have done DNA testing, I would even recommend that you really look carefully and see which of your lines are represented. For instance, I have a lot of my cousins on my mother's side who have tested already. I didn't have to ask them. They just have their DNA out there, and I could ask them to share their ancestry DNA results with me, and I would have access to all of their matches as well. But I have some other lines on my father's side that we don't have much coverage for, and so I need to try to find some people who are living that could take a DNA test to represent those lines. So as you get more comfortable with using your DNA or looking at your matches, you can really kind of look and see where you need to get some more DNA test takers for your family tree.
Yes. And sometimes you won't have anybody, especially if you come from small families or if you descend from an only child of an only child, you may not have a lot of cousins, and that's okay. You just do your best.
Right. And you just broaden out and reach out, go up another generation and broaden out to other family members, see what you can find. And that is the beauty of testing, because I have found so many cousins that I didn't know about and connected with them through DNA, and we've met in person, and we now send Christmas cards. It really is a neat way to even find your family. Well, let's finish up this podcast episode with your task. So each chapter in the book, Research Like a Pro with DNA, has a task for you to do. And so your task for this episode, for this week, is to take a DNA test and upload the raw data to other DNA websites that accept uploads, and following the strategy we just outlined. Then to explore the website of each DNA testing company that you're using and familiarize yourself with the features. Just be warned, each one is very different, so just get used to it. Click on things, see what each one will do for you. And then know that every company website has some kind of a help site. They have a learning center, they have forums, they have blog posts. They recognize that people need help navigating their website. So say you've had your DNA testing at 23andMe and you look at it and it's so foreign to you, so different from Ancestry that you just haven't done much with it. Well, it can be a goal to really learn how to use it and how to explore the many tools and wonderful features. And the same goes for each testing website. They all have different features. You can learn so much, but you have to get familiar with them.
And it's fun. I love learning about each of the features at the testing company websites and just playing around with things, seeing what they have, just learning about the past, about genetics, and about history. They offer so many helpful reports and information. And they're always updating things. So it's just exciting. It's a fun field to be part of. And we're excited to be doing this series. And we hope that as you listen, you will follow along in the book and follow along with the tasks so that you can learn how to research like a pro with DNA.
All right. Well, everyone have a great week, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your research. If you want to learn more, purchase our books, Research Like a Pro and Research Like a Pro with DNA on Amazon.com and other booksellers. You can also register for our online courses or study groups of the same names. Learn more at FamilyLocket.com/services. To share your progress and ask questions, join our private Facebook group by sending us your book receipt or joining our courses. To get updates in your email inbox each Monday, subscribe to our newsletter at FamilyLocket.com/newsletter. Please subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. We read each review and are so thankful for them. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.